All right, Suzanne, thanks so much for doing this web series with me. I'm excited to do this. Today we're going to be talking about how immigrant families and bicultural identity affect a person's sense of belonging. So I guess my first question is, just for those who don't know, what makes a person come from two different cultures? What makes up a bicultural identity person, I guess?
Yeah, so it kind of goes back to that conversation around intersectionality. That's a big component to that, where it's like different aspects of a person's identity can really shape their experience, like gender, sexuality, religion. But when we talk about bicultural identity, oftentimes we talk about someone who is navigating two cultures, right? So two cultures meaning maybe the culture that their family came from, right? And maybe the culture that they live in. So for example, being a second generation immigrant, oftentimes you have, your parents, right, who immigrated from another culture, another country, and you are the product of that. So it's like you are raised, with that influence, right, from the first generation immigrants, but then you're also living in that dominant country that you're in. So it's navigating that culture, right? So for example, in my case, I am Arab American. So I'm second generation. My parents, immigrated from Palestine. I was born and raised in the US. So it's a lot of, taking on a lot of that, being Arab and, being raised in that household, but also being American, right? And, you know, um, and yeah, whether it's through like just, pop culture or just kind of the mindset and, um, the individualistic versus the collectivistic, right? That's also a big piece, especially when it comes to like Arab clients, or I'm sure maybe in other cultures too. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I would say that that is a summary of that.
Yeah, and how do family sort of family the family dynamics play into that? What is how does that sort of fit in?
Fit in. Yeah. So in the example that I gave, and I'm sure, of course, there's so much to that. But like for example, in the example that I gave, you know, being first generation, being a first generation immigrant, you have kind of your own process. There's similarities and differences with the generation, right? So, for example, someone who's first generation, who just came to, the US, right? Or whatever country that they're going to, and of course, depending on how old they were when they immigrated, they're having to navigate different challenges, right? A lot of it is survival, right? A lot of it is survival, finding a way to adjust, adapt, to a totally maybe different culture, right? Different rules, different standards, um, different expectations. Maybe it is about survival, getting, finding a living, and making it out in that new country, right? Whereas someone who is maybe more second generation, they're not as much in that survival. I mean, yes, there is some of that, but it is more about trying to navigate their identity, right? Navigating their identity, navigating, how quote unquote Arab they are, how American they are, um, maybe trying to work on maybe better uh, connecting to getting their emotional needs met, like as opposed to like survival, like, finding a place to stay, so
Mm-hmm.
that is definitely one piece to it, a big piece to that.
Mm-hmm. And how does one sort of navigate one's identity? I don't know what that was like for you.
Navigating my identity.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was definitely a challenge, it's definitely something that, I still navigate, and I'm sure other people still navigate. But I think something that I've, learned over time, and also just within my skills as a therapist, whether it's supporting clients and also just in my own journey, is you get to decide that for you. You get to decide what aspects of a culture maybe align with you and maybe what are aspects that maybe don't. And you can integrate both. You don't have to choose, to be one way or the other. You can create that in for yourself, right? So me being Arab American, that might look different to someone else, right? So there might be aspects of my culture that I really cling on to and that really speak to me, and maybe for someone else, that might not resonate with them as much. But there's no like rule, like, okay, you are in the Arab threshold, you are in the American threshold. It's and it's definitely just a lot of different things. And I think for me, one of the biggest pieces was maybe getting my family, like the first generation, to kind of understand the unique challenges that the second generation faces, right? Because oftentimes there's this expectation from the culture that they grew up in, right? To maybe be more traditional or to be a certain way. But that's really hard to do when you live in the US,
Hmm.
when a lot of that maybe conflicts. So I think for me, some of the challenges that I faced is, for example, getting my family to understand, like my parents to understand that the same as I'm not going to be the same Arab woman that grew up in Palestine, right? I'm going to present a little different because I was raised in the US. So really
Hmm.
understanding that struggle too, right? Because it's like you have the outer influence of being in American society, right? Whether it's school, college, friends, just the culture. And then at home, there's these rules and there's these expectations. So just really trying to navigate that, that can bring up a lot of anxiety, a lot of challenges. Um, and it's something that a lot of my clients, speak about.
Hmm. Because I remember last year, um, I come from two different cultures. My mother's Colombian, my father's Hungarian. I have lots of cousins over there, and I think I have like an uncle, um, on my Hungarian side of my family. And so this past year, my dad and I decided to go to Hungary to really explore the culture, food, traditions there. I've been going to Colombia a lot, but I said, I wanna I want to know my dad's side of the family. I want to know what that's like because I haven't. This was my first time going, so I'm like, I should really go. And so I've been trying to incorporate those two pieces of my culture together, and it's been really great.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think, that's also the thing too. It's like you don't have to choose one or the other, right? It's like that is your personal journey. That is your journey to explore all those aspects of you or what make you you, whether it's your history, whether it's your family, whether it's just, yeah, exploring that. So, yeah.
Hmm. So, but then how does that sort of translate to your private practice with Arab Muslim clients? How have they sort of been able to navigate their own sense of identity, with them being bicultural and just kind of the family dynamic aspect of it?
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, that's that's definitely a big piece. Like I would say a big majority of that. Um, so Yeah, so I think one of the biggest challenges I would say is kind of goes back to kind of what I shared a little earlier is expectations. Managing expectations, right? The expectations that others maybe put on them, and then trying to figure out kind of what resonates and speaks to them. So I know that for a lot of Arab clients or Arab Muslim clients, there is a lot of guilt. There is a lot of um, guilt around a desire to maybe embrace some of the individualistic, messages and kind of wanting to be themselves and explore what that is. And a lot of times that can conflict with families' expectations, right? So that is something that a lot of times they come in with, right? It's like, okay, like, how do I have these conversations? Or, how do I reconcile that? And, a lot of the therapy is just allowing space for that challenge, right? And the feelings that come with that, whether it's grief, whether it's frustration, whether it's confusion, whether it's feeling lost. And, by giving space to those feelings and naming it as this is what a lot of this is. Because sometimes, clients will come in and they'll be like, oh, I'm having social anxiety, or, I'm having a hard time, just managing, feeling depressed. And they won't they won't quite, with therapy, they start to kind of connect the dots to where a lot of that is stemming from, right? It's them feeling lost. It's them feeling like maybe they don't have a space to, explore different aspects of themselves without there being a fear of judgment or retaliation, or, um, feeling like it's wrong. And I think a lot of the therapy work is really getting them to a place of like, well, you don't have to like choose. Like, this could be part of your journey. Like, part of the journey is exploring what that feels like for you, and you don't have to have that all decided,
Hmm.
And yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, what do you do as a therapist to sort of help them help Arab Muslim clients, with those struggles of identity and sort of bicultural identity and the sort of the family dynamics aspect of it. So, like, is there a modality? What do you do in your in those sessions?
In the sessions, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm a
Hmm.
trauma therapist. So I tend to look at things from a lens of trauma. And one of the things that I really like to integrate and even just provide even education to my clients about is identity-based trauma. That oftentimes trauma isn't just going through a singular event, right? It's also just a lot about the messages that we get around our identity. And another aspect to this is being Arab, being Muslim, especially in the US, has a lot of hostility. There's a lot of hostilities around that identity. And we sometimes don't, because we're so used to it, especially coming from that background, we don't quite grasp the impact of that, the impact around, shame, the impact of what racism, instances of racism can do over time. The messages that we see on, in the media about Arabs and Muslims, the rhetoric that we hear people of power saying about these identities, we don't sometimes quite grasp that impact over time, because there is an impact over time, and that does bleed through, and that does, you know, get in the way of feeling safe and feeling like we can fully express and just be ourselves. So I think for me, as far as like a therapy, it's a lot of psychoeducation around identity-based trauma, right? Like, what have you been told? What are the messages that you've received about being Arab? What are the messages that you've received around being Muslim? What are the messages that you've received around being queer? Just kind of exploring that can be very healing, and providing space for those feelings around that. And I usually like to allow a lot of narrative approaches. So narrative therapy is a lot about storytelling. So really just giving the client space to kind of share their life story and around their identities and their upbringing, and just kind of exploring that can be very healing. Um, Especially coming from a culture, Arab culture is a lot about poetry and storytelling and, community. So that is a big part of our culture. So that is an
Hmm.
aspect that I like to draw from even in our sessions. And another piece is, being Palestinian. There's an active genocide. Our community has been through a lot. And I even like to encourage the client to lean into what gives them strength. What gives you strength? What helps you what inspires you to keep go moving through life being this identity? You know, what are the aspects of that identity that you're really proud of? You know, whether it's like, dancing, or whether it's music, or, making food for your family, so even just those things, I like to emphasize that. And that is also historically how a lot of these communities have thrived or have continued to keep going in the face of, all this negativity. So I like to draw from that too.
Mm-hmm. Because I was gonna ask, what are some of the common stories that you sort of listen from Arab Muslim clients, about their sort of identity and how they can like navigate sort of the family dynamics? What are some of the common themes, if you will?
Common themes of what clients come in with
Yeah.
around that. Okay, yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot, and there's a lot, whether it's like gender, right? So especially being an Arab woman, that comes with so much on its own, just being an Arab woman. So in our culture, generally, you know, even just like within the Arab culture, women represent a lot of honor, right? There's this emphasis on honor. There's this emphasis on being the good daughter. There's this emphasis around, an expectation of how an Arab woman should be. So a lot of times I see that with my clients, right? Like there's this expectation of, being kind of like, not feeling safe enough to express how they feel, or, this fear around being too much, or what will happen if I disagree with someone, right? There's a lot of fear around that, right? So I see that. There's also, a culture, there's also this theme of being surveillance, right? I know after 9/11, Arabs and Muslims were one of the most heavily surveilled groups. So there is a lot of mistrust. And a lot of that does show up even in therapy, because oftentimes when I get clients, it's usually a lot of times their first time in therapy, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're like, oh, therapy, yeah, they know intellectually it's something that's going to be beneficial, but I can feel the skepticism, and I can feel the, are you kind of on my side? It's like, can you understand me? Do you like, can you fully understand my lived experience? And I know for me it's a little easier because I do come from that background. So that trust isn't as apparent as maybe it was a different provider, but
Mm-hmm.
that is something. Um, I would say people pleasing, perfectionism, this pressure to you live up to, parents' expectations because they sacrificed, right? They came to the US and they had to, leave, really difficult situations in their home country. And sometimes there's this guilt of like, am I honoring that if I don't do XYZ, right? Or if I'm not this type of son or daughter.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so there's definitely a lot. There's definitely a lot of things that I see.
Mm-hmm. And what have you learned as as a clinician, like in terms of helping those folks, navigating their identity and sort of navigating through this really complex world of, yeah, of just like navigating identity and um really uh, the family aspect of it. Like, what have you learned as a clinician, basically?
Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot that I've actually been surprised, like things that have surprised me even. I know for me, like, as a therapist, I naturally wanted to work with clients that come from my background, right? Because there isn't a lot of Arab or
Mm-hmm.
Palestinian or Muslim providers, therapists. So there was that. But something that actually really surprised me was there's times where I feel a little disconnect with some of those clients.
Mm-hmm.
And at first I was like, I was kind of like, huh, like what's that about? Because we come from the same culture, right? I would assume. I'm like, oh, we come from a similar culture. I would think that there was more of that. Like, I didn't expect that. I didn't expect so much of that disconnect at times. And I think a lot of it is what I was picking up on is a lot of the shame around being in therapy. And still that layer of mistrust that even though, I am also an Arab or a Muslim or Palestinian, I still am a therapist. And that therapist is part of this. It's like almost like there's still a level of mistrust around mental health services. And also, like, is this something that could help me? Or is this a service that could really help someone like me who comes from this lived experience? So, something that I've had to do, even in my sessions, is really just getting the client just comfortable in the sessions, right? And really talking about expectations of therapy and kind of what therapy is and what therapy isn't. And just having those conversations as opposed to like diving right into like the trauma work or, working through the anxiety. Um, so that's I think a layer that I've definitely learned kind of working with these clients and really just building that relationship and um, really just exploring kind of what their values are and what works for them and what maybe doesn't, and kind of helping them find what is going to align for them.
Hmm. Yeah, and lastly, you mentioned that there was a level of mistrust going on in the mental health realm, particularly with regards to Arab, like sort of this idea of there's not a lot of trust going on. So what I'm wondering is, to sort of really develop that trust, how can you how what can be done to sort of really create a sense of trust that says, hey, I got you, I see you, that builds this sort of tribe, this community. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. So I think one, just really validating and kind of naming the the struggle and the challenges of even going to therapy or having to, or even taking that risk, really naming that for them. And also, I would say like something that's worked for me is also, telling them a little bit about me, being a little bit more open to disclose. I know when it comes to self-disclosure as a therapist, it's very nuanced, it's very case by case. Um, but at the end of the day, it's always about what you think is going to be therapeutic and helpful for the client. So I think for me, something that's helped me with these clients is me just telling them just kind of basic things about myself. I'm Palestinian. Um, letting them know that I identify with what they're sharing and that maybe it's something that I've also had to navigate or I still navigate. Um, you know, um, so and also just naming it, really naming it in the room, like really just checking in, me being like, hey, like, how are you doing in this moment? How is this landing for you? Um, do you feel seen? Do you feel like we're going the direction that you're needing? What is it like, being with, seeing an Arab therapist, maybe exploring that as opposed to maybe when they've maybe seen a therapist of a different background. Because that's also the other piece too, is that sometimes clients will come in because they've been to other therapists. They have some of them, and they just didn't feel, they felt like they had to explain and really use that time to educate the therapist.
mhm,
And whereas like when they come to me, they're like, oh, well, yeah, I didn't have to explain any of that. Like you understood like the things that the dynamic that I have with my dad, you understood it. You got kind of what that you had an idea of what that looked like for me.
mhm,
So
yeah.
yeah, so I think there's a lot of that.
Mhm. All righty.